It started with a sentence that barely sounded like a sentence at all. Quiet, almost procedural. I need to see these emails. Not shouted, not demanded, just stated with that calm precision of someone who believes the ground beneath them is starting to shift. Someone who knows that doing nothing might already be too late. At first glance, it seemed almost ordinary. Routine. Another day in the endless swirl of palace business. But inside the quiet chambers of Buckingham Palace, routine had a way of turning dangerous, because the person asking wasn't just anyone. It was Prince William. And what he was about to uncover would not just rattle the walls of the palace, it would send tremors far beyond them, shaking the very foundations of what the public thought they knew about Meghan Markle. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, a figure who, depending on whom you asked, had either captured the hearts of millions or provoked a level of suspicion and scrutiny that borders on obsession. She had made headlines for years, yes, but this wasn't about headlines. This wasn't about gossip or even the usual palace drama. This was about something far more intimate, something hidden, something encrypted. Encrypted emails. The term itself is clinical, sterile almost, but the reality was anything but. Because within those encrypted threads, William found a trail, a digital breadcrumb path that led directly to one of the most sensitive, controversial, and closely guarded stories in recent royal history, the creation of Finding Freedom. The biography that promised to give the public an inside look, told with the voice of a friendly outsider, painting a picture of Harry and Meghan that was, up until now, largely uncontested, a narrative that Meghan had publicly denied influencing. And yet, the emails told a different story. William's discovery wasn't sudden, like a dramatic reveal in a movie. It came slowly, almost imperceptibly, one email at a time. One subtle signature of coordination, one carefully phrased line hinting at intention. At first, it could have been brushed off. Innocent inquiries, curious suggestions, friendly advice, but patterns emerged. Lines repeated, connections became undeniable. The evidence stacked itself quietly, methodically, until it could no longer be ignored. What does it mean when the public narrative, what everyone believes, what millions have read, what countless journalists have reported, turns out to be carefully curated behind the scenes? When the words that seemed spontaneous, authentic, and revealing are revealed to have been guided, shaped, even fed by the very person denying involvement, William faced questions that were both professional and deeply personal. Had this been an innocent attempt to clarify details, or a deliberate shaping of the story, designed to position himself, or perhaps the couple, in a way that suited a broader agenda? And if the latter, what does it say about trust? About loyalty? About the very notion of truth in a family that operates under the constant gaze of the world? The emails themselves were remarkably precise, not casual, not haphazard. Each one bore the hallmarks of careful orchestration sent through layers of encryption that suggest both caution and intent. The kind of caution that signals the sender knows the stakes. The kind of intent that makes denial more than a simple misstatement. It makes it a contradiction. What made it more astonishing was the context. Meghan had, for years, publicly maintained she had no role in shaping the biography, no direct contact with ghostwriters, no influence over the unfolding narrative. Statements were clear, repeated, and delivered with a certain polished conviction. I had nothing to do with it. And yet, William's discovery showed the opposite, a pattern of covert communication, guidance, and subtle manipulation. The kind of involvement that once revealed could undermine not just credibility, but relationships, alliances, and public perception. The implications are staggering. Consider the palace itself, an institution built on protocol, precedent, and an almost ritualized approach to reputation management. A leak like this, however unintentional, cuts through the machinery of control. It challenges the narrative carefully maintained for decades. It raises questions. Who can be trusted? What else might be hidden? And how will the public, conditioned to see Meghan in a particular light, reconcile these contradictions? For William, the stakes were not abstract. They were immediate. This was about protecting the family, about preserving a semblance of control over the story, about understanding whether this was a breach of trust from someone he had once counted on, or merely a reflection of the pressures, decisions, and miscalculations of a complex modern life lived under relentless scrutiny. And yet, even as he pored over the emails, a different tension built beneath the surface. The more he read, the more he realized that understanding the scope of this communication required more than just noting who sent what. It required interpretation, context, a recognition that the words on the screen were more than information. They were intention, carefully encoded. Each line, each sentence, each timestamp could be analyzed, debated, and theorized about. But the emotional undercurrent was unmistakable. This was more than a digital correspondence. This was a glimpse into strategy, into choice, into a deliberate narrative being constructed under layers of denial. And then there was the timing. These emails weren't isolated. They spanned months, coinciding with key media releases, interviews, and public statements. The pattern was almost surgical, almost precise, matching the cadence of public appearances timed to influence perception at moments when scrutiny was highest. That alone suggested a level of premeditation that could no longer be dismissed as casual or coincidental. It raises a question that many outside the palace have never had to confront. When does guidance become manipulation? When does assistance become influence? And when does private communication cross the line into shaping history itself? William had been forced to confront these questions in real time, the weight of them pressing not just on his mind, but on the responsibilities of his position. Every choice, every decision carried consequences beyond what most of us could imagine. And while the discovery itself is explosive, what makes this story unprecedented is the emotional and ethical dimension. Family loyalty versus public accountability. Personal truth versus curated narrative. Intention versus perception. In a world that thrives on leaks, sound bites, and viral headlines, the emails offered a slow, meticulous story, a story that only William could decipher fully, piece by piece, line by line. Each new message layering tension atop tension. The audience might wonder, how does one even begin to navigate such a discovery? To act on it, to process it, to confront it without exposing everything to the glare of public opinion. William's approach, careful and measured, reflected both his training and his instinct. He did not rush. He did not announce. He did not overreact. He observed. He cataloged. He reflected. And with each reading, the picture became clearer and darker. And yet, even as he traced the path of these encrypted communications, the human dimension remained. Because at the center of these emails was a woman, a public figure, yes, but also a human being navigating pressures, expectations, and choices. And it is in that tension between private intent and public image, between denial and action, between trust and betrayal, that the story truly begins to grip. What William eventually realized, and what few outside the palace could anticipate, was that these emails were not just about the past. They were about influence, perception, and control. They were about the very narrative that would shape how history remembered Meghan Markle, and by extension, how it remembered the family she had joined. The consequences of revealing or concealing this information could not be underestimated. And here's the chilling part. The emails didn't just expose potential contradictions. They hinted at strategy. Lines that seemed innocent at first glance, phrases that could be dismissed as casual, were in fact markers of intention, suggesting foresight, planning, and a keen awareness of the impact every word could have on the wider narrative. In short, they were evidence of someone who was playing a long game, crafting the story meticulously from behind a curtain of public denial. So the question becomes unavoidable. How do you reconcile the public statements with the private record? How do you weigh intention against perception, loyalty against exposure, trust against evidence? And perhaps most importantly, what will the family do with this knowledge? Will they confront, contain, or broadcast? And at what cost? By now, you might be wondering, what exactly did William find in the emails? Which words, which messages carried the weight that could shake the palace and the public's perception so profoundly? That, as we'll see, is a story that unfolds gradually, chapter by chapter, revealing layers of complexity, motive, and consequence. And with each revelation, the tension builds. The questions grow sharper, and the implications extend further than anyone could have predicted. Because the truth, in this case, is not simple. It is not neat. It is messy, human, and deeply consequential. And just when it seems you might begin to grasp the full picture, the story shifts again, taking unexpected turns, revealing motives that complicate even the clearest assumptions. It began with a file buried deep in a digital archive, an email account long assumed dormant. The header alone carried the weight of caution, encrypted, time-stamped, marked with an innocuous subject line that belied the significance contained inside. William leaned forward, the palace quiet around him, the soft hum of air conditioning filling the room like a muted metronome, counting the seconds as he opened the first message. The content was subtle at first. Phrases that could have been dismissed as general commentary, suggestions on phrasing, requests for clarification, casual updates. But anyone trained to notice patterns, anyone who understood nuance in language would recognize the cadence. The phrasing was deliberate, the choice of words carefully curated, and the timing, most telling of all, was strategic. Sent at hours when media outlets were likely to digest information, sent ahead of interviews or public statements, as if preparing the narrative before the public ever heard it. William felt a tightening in his chest. It wasn't anger at first, nor shock, but a peculiar blend of disbelief and unease. How had these emails gone unnoticed? How could something so methodically orchestrated coexist with the public story so vehemently denied? And more pressingly, what did it mean for the trust that held a family together? As he scrolled through the chain, the pattern emerged. Each message from Meghan to the ghostwriter wasn't just information, it was instruction. Gentle nudges disguised as casual suggestions. Lines that seemed innocent on the surface carried the weight of strategy underneath. And yet, the tone remained conversational, almost intimate, which made the contradiction all the more jarring. Publicly, she was the observer, the outsider offering reflections. Privately, she was guiding, curating, and shaping the narrative with precision. William paused at one particularly revealing message. A single sentence, almost imperceptible in its construction, contained the kind of specificity that suggested prior knowledge of events not yet publicly disclosed. The phrasing was casual, almost offhand, but it revealed a keen awareness of timing, consequence, and narrative impact. The moment demanded pause. It demanded consideration. How much of what the world had believed about Meghan's distance from finding freedom was true? And how much was the result of careful, calculated guidance behind the scenes? He read on, the tension building. A pattern became undeniable. Emails clustered around key media events, press interviews, magazine articles, televised appearances, all preceded by messages that subtly framed the discussion. There were suggestions, small corrections, a guiding hand shaping perceptions, carefully balancing honesty with image management. It wasn't heavy-handed, it wasn't overt, it was deliberate, controlled, and profoundly effective. And then the emotional layer hit. William, like anyone, was not just processing information, he was processing intent. Actions are one thing, but motive is far more complex, far more unsettling. Each email carried an implication, a message delivered, a narrative nudged, a public perception influenced without disclosure. It wasn't merely about what Meghan did, it was about why. And the answer was not simple. Was it protection? Ambition? A desire to set the record straight on her own terms? Or was it a more strategic, long-term shaping of the story that served a broader agenda? As he navigated the chain, one email seemed to hum with significance. Short, direct, casual in tone, but the content suggested foreknowledge of upcoming questions and events that no casual observer could predict. It wasn't just guidance, it was foresight, a roadmap for public engagement that paralleled, and in some cases preempted, real-world events. The implications were impossible to ignore. Whoever had written these emails was not merely participating, they were orchestrating. The human element made the situation even more complex. Emails are, in theory, impersonal, cold, digital. But these were not transactional. There was warmth, familiarity, humor hidden between lines, a tone that suggested comfort and rapport. And that was the unsettling part. Because it wasn't just strategy being revealed, it was a personal connection, one that complicated the lines between guidance, influence, and manipulation. William was forced to consider not only what had been communicated, but the nature of the relationship that allowed it. And there was more than one voice. Responses from the ghostwriter were careful, almost deferential, but also assertive in ways that suggested understanding of the stakes. The dialogue was layered, a dance between writer and subject, each step calculated, measured, and nuanced. Every sentence had weight. Every pause carried meaning. It was an exchange that could be dissected endlessly, yet some elements would always remain opaque, a deliberate ambiguity, a strategic opacity that made the discovery simultaneously illuminating and frustrating. At this point, William had to consider the broader context. Publicly, Meghan's involvement in finding freedom had been a point of contention and speculation. Defenses had been issued, statements released, interviews given, all claiming distance, impartiality, and lack of influence. And now, Private evidence suggested otherwise. There was a tension, almost a friction, between what was said and what was done, a contradiction that no amount of PR or narrative framing could reconcile completely. He paused again, reflecting on the emotional complexity. This wasn't merely a breach of protocol. It was a challenge to trust, both familial and institutional. Families navigate disagreement, families reconcile differences. But what happens when one person's actions, even if well-intentioned, undermine not just public perception, but the internal cohesion of the family? William had to grapple with that reality in real time, weighing the implications with both prudence and an awareness that every decision carried consequences far beyond the immediate. Then there was the timing. The emails weren't scattered randomly across the calendar. They coincided with critical public moments: statements about media harassment, interviews with high-profile journalists, release schedules for major media outlets. Each message, when viewed collectively, formed a web of influence, subtle but undeniable. It suggested planning. It suggested awareness of how information traveled, how it was digested, and how perception could be shaped before the public even knew a story existed. William understood, in that quiet room, that he wasn't merely reading emails, he was reading strategy. He was reading a blueprint for shaping public narrative from behind a veil of denial, and the clarity of that realization was as exhilarating as it was unsettling. He questioned, naturally, the intent behind each line. Was it to protect, to correct misconceptions, or to sculpt an image that would later serve as defense, justification, or vindication? And perhaps most unnerving of all, was it part of a conscious long-term plan to control the narrative surrounding her public and private life? As he reached the end of the visible chain, one final message remained, a line that was as innocuous as it was explosive, short, almost conversational. But it revealed coordination, awareness, and an unmistakable hint that the narrative, the one the world had consumed as authentic and spontaneous, had been carefully guided at every turn. And with that, the weight of the discovery settled fully. It wasn't just evidence. It was a revelation of influence, intention, and careful orchestration. A quiet but seismic moment that would ripple through family, media, and public perception alike. William leaned back, letting the room's quiet wash over him. And then a thought struck, sharp and unyielding. If this could be uncovered, what else might remain hidden, waiting to be discovered? What other correspondences, what other arrangements lay just beyond view, shaping the story that the public thought they knew? He knew, instinctively, that the path forward would not be simple. Every move now carried risk. Every disclosure, deliberate or accidental, could ignite consequences beyond calculation. And yet, in that very tension, in that space between discovery and decision, the story had only begun. Because the next message, the one that would tie the narrative together in a way no one anticipated, was just beyond his reach. And what it contained would challenge everything he thought he knew, not just about Meghan, but about the story the world had been told, and the secrets still carefully encrypted behind her polished public image. And when he finally opened that next message, William understood the magnitude. The story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The message opened with a date and timestamp, ordinary enough on its surface, but it was the content that carried the weight. A single line, short, precise, almost casual, yet it crackled with significance. It referenced an upcoming media appearance, hinting at phrasing, tone, and even subtle narrative cues that would, if followed, shape perception before the cameras even started rolling. William stared at it, the quiet palace air thick with tension. Every word in that message was intentional. Every phrase a subtle nudge guiding the narrative that the world believed was spontaneous and independent. At first, it was almost unbelievable. He had seen hints, small patterns before, but this was orchestration. This was strategy hidden beneath the veneer of casual correspondence. And yet, the brilliance and danger lay in its subtlety. No one reading it casually would notice the weight of its instructions. It was invisible influence, shaping headlines before they existed. He scrolled further, eyes narrowing. Another message appeared, this one with a brief list of talking points for an interview. The points themselves weren't radical or controversial. They could almost pass for helpful advice. But the timing, sent hours before a press briefing, was deliberate. The phrasing, subtle cues designed to elicit empathy, to frame events in a particular light, to steer questions without ever explicitly dictating answers. William's stomach tightened. Here was the contradiction again. Publicly, Meghan had maintained distance from the biography, claiming neutrality, saying she had no role. The emotional layer was inescapable. These weren't just instructions or suggestions. They were cues designed to guide perception, evoke specific reactions, and maintain control over narrative outcomes. It was strategy embedded in casual language, influence hidden within seemingly ordinary correspondence. And that was what made it so disorienting, so potent. William paused on a message referencing an interview snippet. It wasn't coercive. It wasn't directive. It was phrased as guidance, a casual suggestion to emphasize certain details. Yet when cross-checked with the published interview, the phrasing matched almost perfectly. Implementation was not only evident, it was seamless. The public narrative had been shaped quietly, deliberately, and effectively. The weight of this realization pressed heavily on him. It wasn't simply about biography, interviews, or media appearances. It was about influence, perception, and control. It was about the delicate balance of family trust, public credibility, and the narrative that millions consumed as authentic. The contradiction between private orchestration and public denial wasn't simply a breach of protocol. It was a fundamental ethical and relational challenge. He noted another subtle pattern. The timing of these emails often preceded high-visibility media moments by hours, sometimes days. There was an intentionality in the sequencing, a careful anticipation of events, suggesting that these instructions were preemptive rather than reactive. The narrative wasn't responding to the public, it was being steered in advance. William's mind considered the implications. How much of the public persona, the image meticulously maintained over years, had been guided by these hidden correspondences? How much of what the world believed about spontaneity, authenticity, and independence had been shaped by private orchestration? And if this pattern extended further than the emails he had uncovered, what else might lie hidden? Then he noticed a particular reference that tightened the knot in his chest, a notation about aligning emotional emphasis across multiple anecdotes. It was brief, almost invisible, yet it suggested coordination not just with the ghostwriter, but with the broader narrative arc of public perception. This was influence at scale, executed subtly but effectively across different moments in time. The human element was unavoidable. He could analyze strategy, timing, and phrasing all he wanted, but at the core were people, intent, decisions, and ethical complexity. The correspondence reflected awareness, foresight, and control, but it also reflected human judgment, instinct, and perhaps self-preservation. Separating calculation from human motivation was difficult yet essential to understanding the scope and implications of what he had discovered. William leaned back again, the weight settling. Each prior message, each previous insight coalesced into a chilling clarity. This was sustained orchestration, not casual input. It was deliberate, calculated, and executed over time, with a level of subtlety that made it nearly invisible to anyone not scrutinizing the details. And the contradiction with public denial made the discovery all the more profound. Then he saw the final line, the one that tied the threads together. Almost casual, almost offhand, it referenced a cross-check with prior drafts, ensuring that public messaging and private guidance remained in sync. It confirmed the pattern, the intent, and the execution. The orchestration was complete, verified, and undeniable. And yet, even with confirmation, the tension remained, because knowing this was one thing, deciding what to do next was another entirely. Every option carried risk. Confrontation could create conflict, silence could perpetuate deception, disclosure could ignite public speculation. The choices were fraught, ethical, and emotional, and none offered clarity without consequence. He understood something fundamental. The emails weren't just evidence. They were a blueprint for influence, perception management, and narrative control executed quietly, consistently, and effectively. And somewhere beyond these lines, beyond this correspondence, lay additional threads, unseen but potentially far-reaching. The next discovery could escalate the situation, reshape relationships, and challenge assumptions in ways no one could fully predict. William felt the tension settle in a new way. The discovery was not an endpoint, it was a threshold, a gateway into understanding not just what had been orchestrated, but the scope, the intent, and the consequences that could unfold. And as he prepared to follow the next lead, he realized the magnitude of what lay ahead. Because the story, meticulously crafted in secret and carefully concealed behind public denials, was about to move from private discovery to a broader reckoning, and the consequences would reach far beyond the walls of the palace. The email sat there, innocuous, almost banal on the surface, but William knew better. In the palace, Small details carried outsized weight, and this one, just a few lines long, was loaded with implications. Ensure alignment across narratives before the next interview, it read. Casual words, but calculated. Alignment. Narratives. Interview. Each term was chosen, precise, almost surgical. This was not mere guidance. This was influence disguised as civility, subtle shaping of a story that had been presented to the world as spontaneous, uncoached, and authentic. At first, it was hard to process. One message alone could be dismissed. Maybe it was practical advice, a suggestion meant to help someone avoid missteps, but William had seen enough patterns to know when a single note was part of a larger design. And the more he scrolled, the more he realized this was not an isolated incident. It was a chain spanning months connecting to interviews, media releases, and pivotal moments in the public life of the Duchess of Sussex. The subtlety was remarkable. Nothing overtly coercive, nothing that would trigger alarm at first glance. Yet the intention behind the phrasing was unmistakable to anyone trained to read between the lines. Certain anecdotes were highlighted, others downplayed, and even the timing of the communications suggested foresight. Events that seemed spontaneous had, in fact, been anticipated, guided, and strategically shaped. William paused. He ran his hand over his face, leaning back in the quiet palace room. He thought about public denials, the repeated statements of independence from the biography, claims of no involvement in ghostwriting, assertions of distance. And now, privately, the emails suggested something quite different. Ongoing guidance, subtle instruction, deliberate influence. The contradiction was glaring, not a minor oversight, not a fleeting miscommunication, a structural divergence between public image and private orchestration. He began cataloging the emails, noting timestamps, references, and cross-checking with public appearances. One email suggested minor phrasing changes in anticipation of a magazine interview. Another advised on the framing of an anecdote for maximum empathy. Nothing drastic in isolation, yet together, a pattern emerged, a pattern of carefully managed influence. Every interaction with the press, every detail of the biography seemed to carry the echo of this guidance. The emotional impact was immediate. This was more than a question of public perception. This was about trust, family trust, personal trust, and the trust embedded in institutional protocol. A private influence operating while public statements asserted neutrality. What did that mean for credibility, for cohesion, for honesty within the palace? And how would the public reconcile these contradictions if they ever became known? As he traced the emails further, William noticed subtle emotional cues woven into the messages. Guidance on how certain stories should be presented, lines that encouraged particular interpretations, suggestions that emphasized vulnerability, empathy, or relatability. It wasn't manipulative in an overt sense, but the orchestration of emotion was undeniable. Each line was calibrated to shape perception quietly, effectively. He paused on one particular thread referencing a journalist. The phrasing of the suggestion was casual, almost offhand, yet when he checked the published interview, the words appeared almost exactly as advised. Implementation confirmed influence. Guidance had crossed from private to public, subtly shaping what millions consumed as authentic. The realization hit him hard. William considered the broader implications. This was not a single biography or an isolated interview. This was influence at scale, sustained over time, and executed with precision. The contradiction between private orchestration and public denial was not simply a reputational problem. It was a structural tension affecting not just perception, but trust, family cohesion, and institutional integrity. Another layer emerged. Some emails referenced timing in relation to public statements, hinting at sequencing of releases, coordination across media outlets, even the emotional framing of anecdotes. The orchestration wasn't reactive, it was proactive. The narrative had been quietly guided in advance, positioning certain information, shaping interpretation, and controlling perception at critical moments. William's thoughts flickered to the ethical and emotional weight. The communications suggested strategy and foresight, yes, but they were deeply human, too. They reflected instinct, judgment, and awareness of consequences. Separating calculation from intention, action from motive, was challenging but necessary. He traced the thread further, discovering references to prior drafts, subtle annotations suggesting continuity of guidance, nothing overtly incriminating, nothing legally definitive. But the implication was clear. The orchestration extended further than he had first realized. The story the world had consumed as independent and authentic had been carefully guided behind the scenes. William leaned back again, considering the emotional and professional stakes. Every discovery brought more questions. What was the intent? How far had the guidance extended? Could it be reconciled with public statements? And, critically, what should be done now, knowing the contradiction was undeniable? Every decision, every possible course of action carried consequences for family, institution, and public trust. And then came a subtle, almost invisible reference, a notation about aligning emotional emphasis across multiple anecdotes, linking prior guidance to public appearances and media narratives. It was brief, almost dismissible, yet it confirmed the orchestration. This wasn't isolated guidance. It was systemic, deliberate, and precisely executed. William understood the magnitude. The implications were personal, institutional, and public. This was about influence, narrative control, and perception management, all operating under the cover of plausible deniability. The emails were evidence, yes, but more than that, they were a map, revealing the architecture of influence that had quietly shaped the public story. The realization settled heavily. This discovery was not the end. It was a threshold. Each new message, each thread, each subtle cue hinted at further coordination, unseen yet consequential. The next step, uncovering the final layers, connecting the orchestration to the broader narrative, promised to illuminate the full extent of influence and perhaps redefine everything William thought he knew. And as he prepared to trace the next thread, he understood the stakes. The story the world believed to be independent, spontaneous, and authentic was about to shift in ways that would... The room felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on the implications of what he was reading. Not physically, of course. It was something subtler, a psychological compression. The kind that happens when a pattern becomes too clear to ignore, when coincidence quietly transforms into design. William went back to the beginning of the chain, not to reread the words, but to reread the timing. Dates, hours, intervals. The spacing between messages was not random. There were clusters, bursts of communication just before key moments. An upcoming interview, a magazine profile, the final edits of a chapter, a television appearance, then silence. Not because the conversation had ended, but because the narrative had been released into the world and no further adjustment was needed. At least not yet. He had seen this rhythm before, in crisis management briefings, in political comms, in any environment where perception had to be steered without appearing to be steered. You don't speak constantly. You speak at pressure points. You intervene only when the story is malleable, before it hardens into record. The emails followed that exact logic, which raised a question that lingered, heavy and unresolved. Who was this really for? On the surface, the guidance appeared personal, protective even, a desire to ensure accuracy, to avoid misinterpretation, to prevent narrative drift. All defensible motivations, all human. But layered beneath that was something more structural, an understanding of how stories propagate, how emotion moves through headlines, how a single phrase can tilt public sympathy one way or another. This was not the language of someone casually correcting a friend's draft. This was the language of someone who understood narrative architecture. William found himself returning to one particular exchange, a short back and forth that revolved around the framing of a single incident. An encounter that, in the public version, had been portrayed as emblematic of isolation, misunderstanding, and quiet resilience. In the email, the suggestion was subtle. Emphasize the feeling rather than the logistics. Let the emotional takeaway lead. The facts could follow. And in the published account, that is exactly what happened. Not because anyone had been ordered to do it, not because a directive had been issued, but because the suggestion had been internalized, adopted, and executed. Influence without fingerprints, guidance without overt command. The more William studied it, the clearer it became that this was not about inserting falsehoods. It was about shaping emphasis, about deciding which truths would be foregrounded and which would recede, about narrative weighting, and that, in many ways, was more powerful than fabrication. He thought about the public statements that had been issued at the time, carefully worded denials, not hostile, not defensive, simply clear, no involvement, no direct contribution, no behind-the-scenes shaping. At the time, those statements had been accepted largely at face value. They had fit a broader narrative of distance, of separation between subject and author, between life and its retelling. Now, sitting with the private correspondence, the picture was more complicated. Not a smoking gun, not a single explosive confession, but a sustained pattern of proximity, of engagement, of narrative awareness that sat uneasily beside the public insistence on detachment. It wasn't that the emails screamed, "I wrote this." They whispered, "This is how it should feel when people read it." William closed his eyes for a moment, letting the implications settle. In the palace, contradictions were not unusual. Public roles and private realities rarely aligned perfectly. But this was different. This was not a matter of tone or protocol. This was a question of narrative ownership, of whether a story presented as independently observed had in fact been quietly co-authored in spirit, if not in line edits. And then there was the encryption itself. That detail kept nagging at him. Why encrypt at all? The content, on its face, was not illegal, not scandalous, not overtly improper. So why the additional layer of protection? Why the deliberate choice to shield these exchanges from casual visibility? Encryption implies awareness of sensitivity, of potential misinterpretation, of risk. It suggests that at some level the sender understood that these communications, if viewed out of context or at the wrong time, could raise questions. Not necessarily because they proved wrongdoing, but because they complicated the official narrative. William had spent enough time around sensitive correspondence to know that encryption is rarely about the content alone. It's about how the content might be perceived. And perception, in this family, was everything. He began mapping the chain against public chronology, not in a formal report, at least not yet, but in his own mind. Interview dates, publication milestones, legal proceedings, moments when public sympathy had surged or shifted. The alignment was not perfect. It never is, but it was close enough to be unsettling. There were messages sent days before major narrative pivots, suggestions about tone just ahead of emotionally charged revelations, notes about consistency and clarity preceding moments when the public discourse tightened around a particular interpretation. Again, none of it was explicit. No one wrote, "We need the public to think X," but the scaffolding was there, the shaping, the pre-framing, and always the same quiet tension. This alongside public denials of any such involvement. William found himself asking a question he had not expected to ask. Was this about control or about protection? The two are not the same, but they can look similar from a distance. Protecting one's story in an environment as hostile as the modern media ecosystem is a deeply human instinct, wanting to ensure that nuance is preserved, that context is not stripped away, that personal experience is not distorted beyond recognition. These are understandable motivations. But control introduces a different dynamic. Control implies intent to steer, to manage, to orchestrate outcomes rather than merely correct errors. The emails sat in that ambiguous space between the two. And ambiguity in institutional settings is dangerous because it leaves room for interpretation, for suspicion, for competing narratives to take root. William knew that if this ever became public, not the raw emails necessarily, but the fact of their existence and nature, it would not be read with charitable nuance. It would be reduced, simplified, weaponized. Public denial versus private guidance would be framed as hypocrisy, as deception, as manipulation. Whether that was fair or not would almost be beside the point. Perception would harden faster than context could catch up. He opened one last thread in the chain, a short exchange, but one that had been referenced obliquely in several later messages. It concerned a biographer's question about sourcing, about how certain details had been obtained. The response, again, was measured, careful. It suggested maintaining the appearance of independence while ensuring factual alignment. The language was almost bureaucratic in its restraint, but the implication was clear. There was an awareness of how the sourcing itself might be scrutinized, and a desire to keep the mechanics of influence invisible, not hidden necessarily, just not foregrounded. That distinction mattered. William sat back, the weight of institutional memory pressing in. The monarchy had weathered scandals, missteps, betrayals, and misunderstandings for centuries. What it struggled with most was not wrongdoing itself, but narrative collapse, the moment when the story the public believed could no longer be reconciled with what emerged. This felt like the early tremor of such a moment, not an earthquake yet, but a fault line, And fault lines, once identified, change how you look at the ground forever. He knew, with a clarity that surprised him, that this could not remain an internal curiosity. It would require careful handling. Not reaction, but process. Not accusation, but assessment. Legal, ethical, and reputational implications would all have to be weighed. And beyond that, there was the family dimension. How do you raise such a discovery? Not as an attack, not as a verdict, but as a question, as a concern, as an unresolved contradiction between what had been said and what now appeared to be true. William understood that the next step would not be technical. It would be human. A conversation, or several, carefully framed, quiet, loaded with subtext. Because once this pattern was acknowledged, even privately, it could not be unseen. And once unseen, it could not be unheard. He closed the file not because he was finished, but because he had reached the point where information alone was no longer enough. Interpretation, context, and intent would now matter as much as evidence. The story was no longer just about emails. It was about trust, about narrative ownership, about the fragile line between protecting one's voice and secretly shaping the chorus. And somewhere, beyond the digital trail, beyond the careful phrasing of encrypted threads, lay the moment when this would have to be addressed, not as a technical issue, but as a question of integrity, loyalty, and consequence. Because the real reckoning would not come from what was written. It would come from what was said next. And who said it, and how. William leaned back in the chair, still processing the weight of the emails he had just examined. The pattern was undeniable, but the picture was incomplete. The correspondence didn't exist in isolation. It connected to someone else, the ghostwriter. The figure behind Finding Freedom, the person credited with shaping the narrative of public events while remaining officially anonymous. Until now, the ghostwriter had been a shadow, a professional presence operating quietly behind the curtain, their influence assumed but largely unverified. William now understood that shadow in a way he hadn't before. The first step was tracing the ghostwriter's role, not the glamorous or dramatic aspects often imagined by the public, but the practical mechanics, their workflow, communication style, and engagement with sources. He needed to understand how this figure operated, how much independence they had, and how much guidance had been absorbed from private communications. The emails suggested a pattern. The ghostwriter wasn't just a passive recorder of stories. They were responsive, engaged, and attuned to direction. Subtle cues from the correspondence were implemented seamlessly in drafts, revisions, and suggested edits. Suggestions were acknowledged, often rephrased for clarity, and strategically integrated into the narrative. In short, the ghostwriter acted as both conduit and amplifier, translating private guidance into public perception. The subtlety was remarkable. There were no overt instructions in the emails, no explicit commands dictating the story. Yet, influence was clear: timing, phrasing, emotional emphasis, each carefully aligned with key moments. Anecdotes intended to highlight vulnerability, courage, or relational dynamics were quietly guided, shaped by private suggestions. Publicly, these moments appeared organic. Privately, they were orchestrated. William paused on one particular thread where the ghostwriter responded to guidance regarding a chapter about family interactions. The tone was neutral, professional, but every paragraph reflected careful attention to the recommendations provided. Minor adjustments, sentence structure, emphasis, even punctuation were incorporated with precision. It was clear that the guidance was absorbed, not rejected, and that the ghostwriter understood the stakes. The implications were profound. Public readers assumed spontaneity, authenticity, and independence. The ghostwriter's integration of guidance suggested that the narrative had been influenced in a way that maintained plausible deniability. There was no overt breach of professional ethics, but the orchestration raised questions about agency, influence, and the boundaries between subject and author. William reflected on the duality of the relationship. On one hand, the ghostwriter was a professional, a neutral conduit for storytelling. On the other hand, their proximity to the subject and responsiveness to subtle guidance allowed private intentions to shape the public narrative. That duality was the linchpin of the pattern he was beginning to recognize. He considered the professional background of the ghostwriter: skilled, experienced, trusted by both sources and publishers, able to navigate the pressures of high-profile biography without leaving visible fingerprints. That expertise, combined with discretion, created the perfect environment for private guidance to influence public perception subtly, effectively, and without detection. Another layer emerged: The human element. Emails contained small, seemingly casual exchanges that suggested rapport, familiarity, even trust. Humor and lightness threaded through messages that were, at their core, strategic. That balance of warmth and direction made influence almost invisible. The public consumed the narrative as natural and authentic, unaware of the private scaffolding that supported it. William paused, considering the ethical implications. Influence in private communication isn't inherently wrong, but when the guidance systematically shapes public perception while denying involvement, the contradiction becomes unavoidable. The question was no longer about isolated emails or minor suggestions. It was about the architecture of influence itself, a framework designed to shape perception quietly, consistently, and strategically. He traced multiple threads connecting the ghostwriter to specific chapters. Each narrative beat, each anecdote, each emotionally charged moment could be traced back to prior guidance. Timing, phrasing, and focus aligned perfectly with suggestions in private emails. The ghostwriter had acted as both translator and executor, turning private cues into narrative shaping without ever drawing attention to the process. William understood the complexity. There was skill involved, yes, but there was also intent. The ghostwriter facilitated influence in a way that maintained plausible deniability. The coordination was subtle, layered, and deliberately non-intrusive. Yet the cumulative effect was clear. The public story, the narrative that millions accepted as independent, had been quietly shaped according to private guidance. He thought about the broader implications. Influence, coordination, and subtle shaping are human behaviors, but in the context of public perception, they become significant. The ghostwriter had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, served as an instrument of narrative construction, transforming private suggestions into public reality. The ethical and emotional tension of that realization pressed heavily on him. Then William noticed a subtle clue in the correspondence. One email referenced a prior draft with a note about emotional emphasis, how certain anecdotes should evoke empathy without appearing directed. The ghostwriter acknowledged it and implemented the phrasing exactly. That was the moment the orchestration became undeniable. The line between narrative independence and guided influence had blurred completely. He leaned back, reflecting on the delicate balance of professional responsibility, personal trust, and narrative integrity. The ghostwriter had operated professionally, transparently, and competently, yet the private guidance they absorbed had the power to shape public perception in ways the audience, and even some insiders, had never realized. William realized the challenge ahead, understanding the ghostwriter's role without casting judgment, tracing the influence without oversimplifying, and deciding how to respond to a pattern that was subtle, systemic, and consequential. There was one final unsettling observation. The correspondence hinted that the ghostwriter was aware at least partially of the stakes. Certain phrases suggested recognition of sensitivity, an understanding that public perception could be destabilized if the pattern of guidance were revealed. Even indirectly, the awareness of risk indicated that these communications were not simply casual, professional exchanges. They were interactions operating in a high-stakes, high-pressure environment where narrative control and reputation were deeply entwined. The emails had painted a picture, but one crucial question remained unresolved. How much influence had actually been exerted? How deliberate had the shaping of narrative been, and to what extent had the ghostwriter unwittingly amplified it? And more importantly, what might be revealed if additional threads existed beyond what William had already discovered? Because even now, as he traced patterns, timelines, and influence, there was a sense that the full picture had yet to emerge. One final connection, one missing link, could illuminate the entire operation in a way that made the previous emails appear only as the surface of something far more intricate. William's mind raced. The evidence was subtle, complex, and almost invisible, but unmistakable. Influence had occurred. Coordination had occurred, and the consequences, both within the family and in public perception, could be significant once fully understood. And as he prepared to trace that next hidden connection, he realized something chilling. The story was accelerating. The discovery of the ghostwriter's role had clarified much, but it also revealed just how much remained unknown, how much influence might still be hidden, and how far-reaching the implications could be. The more William examined the correspondence, the next layer William began to examine was not a person but a process. Once you accept that influence has traveled quietly from subject to ghostwriter, the immediate question becomes, how did it move through the rest of the system without being flagged? Publishing is not a single conversation. It is a relay. Manuscripts pass through editors, lawyers, fact-checkers, publicists. Each handoff is supposed to act as a filter, a safeguard, a moment where independence is reaffirmed. And yet, Here, the narrative had flowed with remarkable smoothness. No obvious friction, no documented objections, no visible rupture between what the subject privately emphasized and what the public ultimately read. That in itself was revealing. William pulled up a timeline of the book's production cycle: drafts, revisions, legal review windows, media embargoes, interview schedules. The more he overlaid the private correspondence onto this professional pipeline, the clearer the synchronization became. Guidance was arriving not randomly, but precisely when it could still shape structure rather than merely polish language. This was upstream influence, not editing after the fact, but framing before the cement set. And upstream influence is the hardest kind to detect, because by the time the product reaches review, the architecture is already in place. Editors can refine, lawyers can caution, fact-checkers can verify. But none of them are tasked with questioning why a particular emotional arc was chosen over another, or why one anecdote carries narrative weight while another is relegated to a footnote. Those decisions live earlier, in conception, in outline, in tone setting. In the quiet exchanges between subject and storyteller, William noticed that several emails referenced early framing and contextual scaffolding. The language was professional, almost academic. It did not say shape the story this way. It said this is how the context might be understood, a subtle but critical distinction. One preserves the appearance of independence. The other admits direction. But effect, not phrasing, is what ultimately matters. And the effect was clear. He turned his attention to the role of legal review. In royal adjacent publishing, legal vetting is exhaustive. Every line is scrutinized for libel risk, breach of confidence, misrepresentation. The fact that these passages had passed through without objection suggested that, on their face, they were defensible, not false, not defamatory, not reckless, which meant the issue was not truth. It was framing. How truth is weighted, which truths are centered, which are contextualized as central, and which are positioned as peripheral. That is not something lawyers flag. That is narrative. William felt a quiet tension in that realization. Because narrative shaping by itself is not wrongdoing. Every autobiography, every biography, every documentary makes choices, but the contradiction arises when a subject publicly asserts non-involvement while privately engaging in precisely those framing decisions. Again, not a crime, not necessarily even a breach of contract, but a breach of consistency. And in institutions built on symbolic integrity, consistency is currency. He thought about how the ghostwriter, navigating between access and independence, might have rationalized the exchange. From a professional standpoint, receiving contextual insight from a primary source is standard. Valuable, even, it enriches accuracy. It deepens texture. The ethical boundary is crossed only when that insight begins to steer narrative intention rather than inform it. The emails lived in that liminal space. Not dictation, not fabrication, but calibration. And calibration is subtle. It does not announce itself. It aligns. William found himself returning to one phrase that appeared more than once in the correspondence: to avoid misinterpretation. On its face, a harmless goal. No one wants to be misunderstood, especially not in a media environment prone to simplification. But when avoiding misinterpretation becomes a reason to pre-shape emotional response, to anticipate how readers should feel before they even encounter the facts, the line between clarification and narrative management begins to blur. He could see how, step by step, this could have unfolded without anyone involved feeling they were doing anything improper. A suggestion here, a contextual note there, a reminder of sensitivity, a desire to protect nuance. And yet, taken together, it amounted to a quiet partnership in story construction, which brought him to the question of authorization. Had this channel been formally acknowledged? Had advisors known? Had anyone in the institutional apparatus been aware that these exchanges were occurring in parallel to official communications, outside the usual briefing structures? The encryption suggested caution, not secrecy in the criminal sense, but discretion, a recognition that these were conversations better kept compartmentalized. Compartmentalization is another familiar concept in institutional life. Information is shared on a need-to-know basis, not to deceive, but to manage complexity. Yet it also has the effect of creating parallel realities, where different actors operate with different understandings of what is happening. Williams suspected that was the case here. The ghostwriter knew the subject was engaged. The subject knew, the ghostwriter was receptive. The publishing team may have known there was access, but not the extent of narrative guidance. Palace advisors may have known a biography was being written, but not the nature of the private framing discussions. Each layer holding a partial picture, no single person necessarily aware of the full architecture. And that, in systems theory, is how unintended contradictions become institutional crises. Because when fragments of truth collide later, they do so without a shared context. He thought again about how this would look if it ever surfaced, not as the nuanced process-driven reality he was now seeing, but as a simplified narrative of secret coordination versus public denial. The space for explanation would be narrow. The appetite for complexity, limited. That awareness sharpened the importance of how this discovery was handled internally. Not with accusation, with reconstruction. Understanding who knew what, when, and how decisions had been framed at each stage. Understanding whether the public denials had been intentionally absolute, or whether they had simply been imprecise in their language, collapsing a spectrum of involvement into a binary. William began to consider the possibility that the contradiction was as much semantic as substantive. That no involvement had been intended to mean no formal authorship or no contractual control, while the private guidance had been understood internally as informal context sharing. But semantics, once public, become reality, and reality, once fixed in record, becomes difficult to renegotiate. He also considered the emotional dimension for the ghostwriter, a professional who may have believed they were navigating an ordinary, if high-profile subject-author relationship, now potentially implicated in a narrative of hidden influence. The weight of that, should it ever become public, would not be light. Careers are built on trust, on the perception of independence. Again, the issue was not wrongdoing, it was optics. And in the realm of public narrative, optics are often as consequential as facts. William closed the timeline and sat in silence for a moment, letting the thread settle. Tracing the ghostwriter had clarified the mechanism. It had shown how influence could travel quietly, legally, plausibly, through professional channels. How guidance could be absorbed without triggering alarms because it was framed as assistance, not instruction. But it had also exposed something deeper. This was not just about one book. It was about how modern narratives around powerful families are constructed. How access, story, and reputation intertwine. How lines that once seemed clear between subject and observer, between participant and chronicler, have become increasingly porous. And that porosity creates vulnerability, because when boundaries blur, accountability blurs with them. William sensed that the next phase of this inquiry would not focus on the writer at all. It would turn toward the institutional response, toward what had been known, sanctioned, or assumed at the time, toward the internal advisories, the legal briefings, the communication strategy that had accompanied the public denials. In other words, toward the point where private narrative management intersected with official protocol. That was the junction he had not yet explored. And it was, he suspected, where the stakes would rise, because once you move from individual correspondence to institutional awareness, the question shifts from what happened to what was permitted, what was overlooked, and what was later contradicted. Those are not literary questions. They are governance questions. And governance in a family that is also a state institution carries consequences far beyond reputation. As he prepared to open the next set of files, those related not to the book but to internal communications around it, William felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear, not anger, anticipation. The sense that he was approaching the layer where narrative, authority, and responsibility converge, where private choices become institutional problems, and where the quiet discovery of emails could evolve into something far more consequential than a question of authorship. The moment William opened the next email, he felt the tension spike. Unlike the prior messages, this one was different in tone. It was urgent, succinct, almost clipped, but with layers that demanded careful reading. A date, a timestamp, and a subject line referencing a recent interview. The message itself contained a series of subtle suggestions, phrased casually, almost as if the sender were offering a friend advice over coffee. Yet the implications were far from casual. William read slowly, line by line. Phrases that initially seemed benign, emphasize the context here or consider how this may be perceived, took on weight when compared with timing and subsequent public output. Each recommendation matched perfectly with what appeared in interviews, articles, and profiles. The guidance had crossed from private communication to public implementation. Not blatant dictation, not instruction, but influence so precise it appeared invisible. He leaned back, letting the realization settle. Influence at this level is disorienting because it operates under the guise of natural storytelling. The public thinks the narrative is organic. In reality, each sentence, anecdote, and emotional beat may have been guided in advance. The contradiction between private engagement and public denial became impossible to ignore. William scrolled further, noticing patterns across multiple threads. Timing was consistent. Advice arrived shortly before interviews or publications, often within hours. Content emphasized emotional nuance, narrative framing, and perception management. The guidance was neither heavy-handed nor obvious. It was surgical. It shaped what readers would notice, how they would feel, and which aspects would dominate attention. A particular message caught his eye. It referenced a conversation that, in the biography, appeared to be spontaneous, a private family moment. The email suggested highlighting certain details while downplaying others to preserve balance and evoke empathy. In the published account, those exact emphases appeared, subtle but deliberate. William realized that these suggestions had influenced how the story was consumed, shaping reader emotion and interpretation without revealing the hand behind it. He paused, considering the emotional dimension. This wasn't manipulation in a traditional sense, but orchestration in the gray space between guidance and influence. The ghostwriter